Now in this video, I'll go over the safety plan template from the Stanley and Brown Safety Planning Intervention. So the safety plan I'll be using has 6 main steps with an optional 7th step. Step 1 is warning signs. Step 2 is internal coping strategies. Step 3 is people and social settings that can provide distraction. Step 4 is people whom I can ask for help. Step 5 is professionals or agencies that I can contact for help. Step 6 is making the environment safe, and the optional step 7 is reasons for living. Once developed, your crisis safety plan is intended to be used in a stepwise, progressive fashion. In some cases, you might only go through step 1 and 2, identifying warning signs and using your internal coping strategies, and then you might start to feel better and not need to go any further. Or in other cases, you might need to go through all the steps and eventually reach out for professional support. So before you begin to start writing your plan, you'll first want to think about the last time you were in crisis. For some of us, that might be a prior suicide attempt, or prior experience of suicidal thoughts, a prior act of self-injury, or other distressing crisis. Now, as you think about that crisis, think about what was happening both internally and in the environment around you before the crisis occurred, during the crisis, and after that crisis. If you're like me, you might be tempted right now to think about the why of that crisis in terms of causation. But for this practice, we really just want to focus on the what with regard to what events occurred at that time without digging any deeper. So, step 1, warning signs. We want to start by identifying some of the earliest warning signs as possible. These might be thoughts, images, your mood, behavior, or other situational factors leading up to that crisis. If possible, list these warning signs in the chronological order in which they occurred. This might give you an indication of escalating signs. The goal is to eventually be able to recognize the warning signs as early as possible, where you might be able to use coping strategies to avoid a crisis altogether. Step 2, internal coping strategies. Now these are things you can do on your own to take your mind off your problems without contacting another person. They could be relaxation techniques, physical activities, mindfulness strategies, or other forms of distraction. I tend to use a mix of physical and cognitive strategies. If you're interested in learning some new cognitive strategies that might be helpful, let me serve you up a bowl of alphabet soup. I would definitely recommend looking into ACT, DBT, and CBT strategies. ACT stands for Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. And CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Step 3, people and social settings that provide distraction. This can really include anyone that you enjoy spending time with that can help take your mind off things. This does not have to be a person that you would normally reach out to in a crisis. In fact, when using your crisis safety plan, in this step, you really wouldn't even need to tell this person that you're struggling. Places could include social settings or even natural settings that provide you with a sense of relaxation or distraction. You'll also want to include phone numbers or contact info for anyone you add to your list. Step 4, people whom I can ask for help. This list should include natural supports, such as close friends and family, that you would be able to reach out to for help. Again, you would want to include their phone number and contact information. Think about the people you would feel safe opening up to, and that would be able to be supportive in a way that would actually help. This step is where accessing your courage and vulnerability will be of utmost importance. This is the step where you may need to speak what might seem unspeakable. So this will need to be someone that you trust and someone that will be understanding. And again, remember that just because something may have been unspeakable in the past does not mean that it must remain unspeakable today. And just because something might feel unspeakable today does not mean that it must remain unspeakable tomorrow. If you were able to develop steps 1 through 3, but you're struggling with this step, that's okay. Crisis safety plans are intended to be a work in progress. There is no such thing as a perfect plan. The most important thing is that we use our experience. And again, we are experts by experience. To learn about ourselves, to identify and access our strengths, and to continue to cultivate the areas of our needed growth. If you don't feel like you have someone that you could reach out to for help today, what would it take to develop that? What would you look for, and how would you identify that person? These are the questions we should all ask ourselves. And once we are able to identify that person, it's also extremely important that we let them know. Tell them how important they are to you and that you consider them as a support. I would also encourage you to directly tell that person that you've created a crisis safety plan and let them know that they're an important part of it. It might even be helpful to give them a copy of your plan. It's also important to have more than one person that you feel safe reaching out to. So once you've identified the first person, try to go through this process again and identify more. Now, if you've identified those people but are having anxiety about letting them know, think about what mode of communication might work best. If in-person or face-to-face seems too intimidating, maybe consider contacting them by email or text. Step 5, professionals or agencies that I can contact during a crisis. This is where you could include your local crisis helpline, the crisis text line, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or other helplines that are available. You could also include the number for behavioral health urgent care if you have such a center in your area. And if you work with any specific mental health clinicians, such as a therapist, you might want to talk with them to determine who to reach out to. They may even offer an emergency contact number. Step 6, making the environment safe. This is an extremely important step, and just as with some of the previous steps, this will require some forethought and proactive measures to be taken, ideally before a crisis occurs. Because of the nature of suicidal crises, most of which only lasting a matter of minutes to hours, one of the most important strategies that we can utilize is that of putting as much time and distance as possible between ourselves and any potentially lethal means. This could include choosing to store all firearms outside of the home, or reducing access to medications so that you only have access to a smaller amount, such as a few days or a week's worth. This could also include getting rid of or remotely storing any other potentially lethal means of suicide that you may typically think of when experiencing suicidal thoughts. Some of these strategies might require help from others, so it's important to think about who might be able to help you make a plan, as well as who might be able to safely store items for you if needed. You may have local or state laws that dictate how and where firearms must be stored. If you don't have anyone that can safely and legally store a firearm for you, some gun shops, shooting ranges, and police stations might be able to provide a safe alternative. For some, keeping your environment safe might actually mean staying with a friend or family member, or just going someplace where you're around others and you're not alone. Or for others whose suicidal thoughts might involve environmental risks outside of the home, it might be best to stay put. Again, having help from a friend can make a huge difference. So if you live alone, you might consider having a support person come stay with you. Step 7, reasons for living. This should include things that are most important to you and worth living for. This is a step where I might really recommend using visual cues, whether it's a photograph of a loved one, or a picture of a place you would like to visit someday, or anything else that's most important to you. For many of us who have experienced suicidal episodes, we can often experience constricted thinking or tunnel vision, where so much of the world falls outside of our view, and we are simply not able to see it. In those times, when our perceptions and perspectives are so narrowed, having a visual image or a visual reminder of the things we love can be extremely helpful. So just as there are things we can do to improve and maintain our general health, coping, and well-being, there are also things we can do to help us through those moments of acute crisis, such as developing a crisis safety plan. Having a plan and practicing using that plan can lead to increased coping skills.
If you like this video, comment, click subscribe, and give a like below. Take a deep breath, now let it out, pull your shoulders back, and hold your head up high. Speak